Now, today I'm really excited. We're going to end this series called Reconcile. And I know you probably saw this. Last night, I kind of declared my allegiance to the University of Michigan, and we lost 31-0. Yeah. It wasn't a good night in the Carter household. But a couple weeks ago, I flew in on a red eye, drove basically straight to South Bend to the University of Notre Dame, and I sat with the foremost leader when it comes to matters of reconciliation and peacemaking in our world. His name is John Paul Lederach, and he's an incredibly humble man, and I sat there with him for about 4 hours, and I was asking him questions in regards to the conflict that's going on in our world from his own experience sitting with warlords and talking with elders and community leaders. I mean, this guy has a plethora of knowledge, and now he's at one of the finer institutions in our land teaching people from all over the world about how to live out the ways of Jesus and talk about peacemaking in real and compelling ways. And so I want you to turn your eyes to the screen, but I want just to warn you, this isn't like a 2-minute video. This is going to be about 8 minutes long, and you're going to hear him just sharing about stories and ideas about how he understands peacemaking and why it's so crucial for today. And then right out of that, we're going to dive right into the scriptures, and I'm going to give you some practical ways in which you can be an everyday reconciler. Turn your eyes to the screen.
Conflict is a part of the human experience. How we respond to conflict is where brokenness, finding ourselves to be less than fully human with each other, that's where it comes in. A lot of the places that I work in the world and over the years are war zones where conflict has taken the expression of violence, armed violence. When you're sitting across from a person who feels absolutely no remorse or any responsibility for the kind of harm and tragedy that they've created, it's a daunting experience. In 1990, I was a part of a small team of people that were attempting to bring the armed factions in Somalia together for a way to figure out a way to end the war at that particular time period. The city was almost unnavigable. We had to literally traverse the city in time periods when we could move when the shooting would stop. And I met with the top leaders, both who claimed the right to become president of the country. And I can remember so very clearly the sensation I had. And it was a mixed feeling. Muhammad Aidid gave his view of why he was justified in doing what he was doing and how his right to become the leader of the country had been taken from him. And I could understand a piece of that. And then he would turn to me and say, and that is why I need you to convince your country to give us weapons. And then I would go over to Ali Mahdi, and he would make the exact same speech. And I can remember looking into both of their faces and asking the question, if there are 1.5 million people about to die of starvation, is it not the time to put down weapons rather than to ask for more? And leaving those rooms, I felt in that moment a sense of evil, and I could see myself in them. They were human beings making a case for something they felt passionately about. This is the joy and absolute reality of peace building. You don't work through these things by having quick answers and magical recipes. It's about relationship, long and hard listening, and creativity. How do we find our way through it? And how do we encourage people to look and look again? Typically, people's view of conflict was that somehow it was attached to sin. They were sinning, we're not. So there's sort of a judgment of who is on what side of that equation. When I go back to the creation story, what you find actually are what I call creation commitments, how God committed to certain basic principles. The most significant of those, when you read the first chapters of Genesis, are commitments to diversity, from the plant life to the animal life to even humankind. And when you combine diversity and capacity to engage and make decision, you actually are creating the fundamental conditions by which conflict is emerging. The notion of all that we have around us and available to us, that richness of who we are, that's exciting. That's flourishing. But it also means that we have to have the highest level possible of handling well that diversity. I think that's part of what we need to increase our ability within, especially congregational setting. If you're asking the question, what's a significant thing to do for ordinary peacemaking? Commit yourself to conversation with people you don't agree with. The keys on this, I think, are our ability to find ourselves in relationship with people who are different than we are. Not to have a conversation where somebody wins or loses, but to have a conversation that permits you to enter into, look at the world from a different view, come back and share the view you have, and not feel that you have to resolve that all in one conversation. The purpose of the conversation is not about winning or losing an argument, but is about deepening understanding. And I wish we had a lot more of this in our churches. We somehow seem to think that truth has to be defended, rather than truth being something that unfolds across a lifetime. If we are incapable of listening to a human being across from us that we don't agree with, how in the world will we possibly listen to the divine who may be saying things that we aren't quite prepared to hear? Judge your own self. Come back and say, to what degree have I developed the patience to really engage and listen when I'm in situations where I disagree with people? The way Jesus moved had a quality of presence to it, and that quality of presence was deeply defined by a form of compassion. The art of peacemaking starts with that fundamental and deep sense of compassion. Compassion, it's much more about how we envision ourselves in relationship with and notice the humanity of the other. Notice something of us in them. Notice something of God present in them, even if they are designated as our enemy, as the wrong person, the wrong community. While I work significantly with people who represent armed movements and governments that are at odds, probably 80% of my work has been at a community level, trying to really work with people in their day-to-day lives and how they will approach, understand, and transform conflicts that are taking place all the time. Too often what's portrayed to us is nothing works here, nothing is right, everything has gone bad. There can be individuals who portray that, but more often than not, hope's found in shared storytelling. How it is that people share what is going on in their lives, what they've come through, what they see, and in particular, their concerns and hopes for children, which is often portrayed as the one place that they retain a sense of both dignity and duty. How do we not pass the legacy of this on to yet another generation? People live according to a mandate of love. Love can only be lived if there's hope. If you lose it, there's nothing worth living for. And when it translates into the most extraordinary thing, what it translated into is not just that I have love for those that I care about in my immediate community or group or family, but that I'm actually willing to take the risk to reach out across the lines of enmity, to reach into those who we may fear, and have hope that our children's children will somehow live differently. Peace is actually about the hard work of becoming a human community. And it's about the exciting work of becoming a human community. It is possible for us as a human family to learn to change things that are not right. Who are we going to be as a human family in this world? How are we going to share the things that we have in this creation? How are we going to set up our relationships? And those, for me, are endlessly fascinating and challenging question. We in our own congregations, in our own communities, face conflicts daily, and we have a lot of ways that we can learn about doing that in more respectful and more constructive ways, and those are the same basic principles that I'm trying to work at, whether it's Nepal, Kenya, or Nicaragua.
When God created the world, it was one. It was united. It wasn't fractured. It wasn't broken. It was beautiful, it was compelling, it was stunning. And every time that there is a conflict, it begins with a disruption. And usually, at the core of that disruption or conflict is a word we are all familiar with. It's a word called sin. Now, sin in Hebrew is the word hatah. And hatah, we often think of it as kind of like an archery term, to miss the mark. But in reality, the word hatah means to lack. See, the world was created and it was one and it was united and there was harmony. It now, with conflict, because of sin, it lacks that. And when someone chooses to sin, what they are doing is diminishing themselves. Sin is the ultimate diminisher. And what it does is it makes that person a lesser human being. Now, if I sin against somebody else, if I hatah against someone else, what am I essentially doing? I'm making that other person less than what God intended and created them to be. When I sin against someone else, I am pushing them down and I am creating a distance and a divide. And today, I want to lean in and ask ourselves, what do we do when we feel less than? What do we do when there is a divide, a chasm between A and B, between what someone has done to us? And usually in this space, it causes something inside of us. For some of us, when someone makes us feel less than, what do? Oh, we fight. We get our fists out and we fight because it's not right. And we want to pull ourselves back up and pull that person down. How many of you are a fighter? If you are fighting with the idea that you are a fighter, you are a fighter. Some of you are getting nudged right now by your spouse. And then on the other side, there's some of us who don't just put up our fists, man. We put our hands in our pockets, kind of put our head down, and it's just the way it is. We just deal with it. And we just hide and avoid conflict. We either find ourselves fighting or hiding. And I believe that there's another way. But even when we see this in the culture, we find ourselves watching people in the midst of this reacting. For instance, I was driving on 59 and I was headed towards 62. And I'm driving, and you know how it's 2 lanes, then it becomes 1 lane, and then like about a mile and a half later it becomes 3 lanes. But I'm driving when it's 2 lanes, and there's like this Honda Civic, and then there is this huge diesel big old truck, and I'm behind them both. And all of a sudden, a race begins. Who's going to be in front when it goes to 1 lane? And the Civic won, all 4 cylinders of it. Cuts it off. And then all of a sudden, you start seeing the horns honking. You see birds being flown out the window. And all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, this is getting interesting. And we pull up to Algonquin, and it's a red light. Now, I'm going to make a right, head to church. When all of a sudden, as I'm driving by, they're still yelling at each other. A guy gets out of the Civic. Guy gets out of the truck, walks up, and the guy from the Civic punches him, knocks the dude out, hits the front of his bumper, and he's just out cold. So I've watched cops. I know how to make a citizen's arrest. I know what to do. I pull the car over and I get out and I look at this guy. He's knocked out, and I look up at the front of his car, and there's this junior high son just watched the whole thing. So I'm like, oh, buddy, are you all right? He's like, what happened to my dad? I'm like, he got knocked out. Sorry, man. And like, I go to see the dad. Then I go to the Civic, and I'm like, hey, you can't leave. You got to stay. And they're like trying to back out and trying to like get around. Still a red light. I'm like, you guys have to stay. You knocked the dude out. You can't leave. Well, they're not going to listen to me. So they just back up and they begin to take off. Now here's where it gets awesome. There is a Lexus about to make a left onto Algonquin. And he decides they're not leaving. and at a 45-degree angle, speeds up to try and block the Civic. And the Civic's like, and just basically crashes into the Lexus, and they spin out in the middle of Algonquin Road. Two of the guys get out, take off running from the Civic. A little fight breaks out between Lexus guy and the Civic driver, and I'm sitting here going, well, that just escalated pretty quickly. I'm like, what in the world? Then all of a sudden, cops are there. I end up having to go back to the police station, file a whole police report of what happened. They're like, what happened? And I was like, yeah. One guy cut off another guy. Dude honks, birds are flowing, red light, knocked out, crash, boom, Lexus totaled. Welcome to conflict resolution. This is what's happening all around us. I mean, this is what happens globally. This is what's happening in our own U.S. Someone has found themselves feeling lesser, and they react, and all of a sudden, it just explodes. And it happens within our churches. It happens within our neighborhoods. It happens within our high schools. It happens all around us. And the truth is, are we going to be the kind of people, when conflict happens, we react in the moment? There's got to be another way. And Jesus, in Matthew chapter 18, paints that other way. It's the Jesus way. It's not about reacting. It's not about fists. It's not about avoiding. It's about having your hands wide open. It's about believing in what a relationship could be. It's about responding to conflict. So if you have a Bible, turn with me to Matthew chapter 18. I want to show you this. It says this, verse 15, if your brother or sister sins or sins against you, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. So if your brother or sister makes you feel less than human because of something that they have done, the scriptures, according to Jesus, are very, very clear. Go directly to that person and show them what they've done. But let's just be honest. A little moment of just full disclosure. What usually happens? Doesn't B usually go to one friend, two friends, three friends, four, begin to talk about what A has done, begin to share, oh my goodness, can you believe what A did? Can you believe what they did? And what are they doing? They're doing the exact same thing that was caused to them. They are lessening the perspective that these friends have now of A. Here's what I want you to understand. The image of God is kind of like Play-Doh. It is. It's formable. It's moldable. And a person can be molded and shaped and formed. And all of a sudden, everyone then begins to see that person through that set of lenses. When we gossip, when we slander, when we react out of our pain, what are we doing? We are taking the role of God and beginning to shape and form a perspective of a person and beginning to showcase this is who A really is. And Jesus says, that is not the way my kingdom works. I go on Facebook and I see how people will begin to speak about another person on their Facebook wall. And I'm like, that's not the way the kingdom of God works. Let me ask you, if someone has made you feel less than what God intended you to be, will you declare right now, I will not be this kind of person who goes off and whispers and posts and talks about A. I will actually go to this person. See, the fighters, all of you who are fighters, you go, oh, that's not right. I'm going to fight. You don't really care about the relationship. This is what fighters tend to do. Fighters tend to care about the issue, and they want to win. It's a competition. I just want to beat that person. Avoiders Avoiders don't care about the relationship. Avoiders just care about protection of self. They don't want to put themselves out there. They don't want to feel any more pain. They just want to protect themselves. But the Matthew 18 way is to actually believe that conflict isn't necessarily always bad. That God can actually do something in the midst of it, that God can reconcile and reunite and restore and renew. You actually value the relationship over yourself or over the issue. Now, I was sitting with John Paul Lederach, and I'm reading this verse to him, and I said, from my experience, the number of people I've counseled, or the people that I've sat with, why, when they actually take Matthew 18 seriously and they approach that person, why does it not always work? Now, I'm sure every one of us has experienced that. We've tried it, and we go, oh, dude, it just made matters more worse. And he goes, oh, that's pretty easy. Because every person who goes into a conflict situation tends to have one primary characteristic. I was like, whoa, tell me more about that. What do you mean? What do you mean? He goes, look at Psalm 85, verse 10. It says this, truth and mercy have met together. Justice and peace have kissed. He says, in that psalm, the psalmist is writing, and he's not just talking about 4 values, it's almost as if each of those 4 words are people. And if you want true reconciliation, if you want to bridge this gap, bridge this chasm and divide, you need to make sure that you are bringing all 4 people to the party. Let me start by telling you about truth. Truth likes to bring things to the light. Truth wants to get at what really happened. All of you right now are probably thinking of a few good men. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. Like you have this moment where truth sometimes, if the tone and posture isn't right, can feel so authoritative. It can just be yelling and screaming. But every one of us, some of us, this is what we always bring. We want to deal with what really happened. Some of us, our primary characteristic when we bring into a conflict area is mercy. And mercy is laid back. Mercy knows that people fall. Mercy knows that sin happens. Mercy knows people are going to rub edges and have conflict. So mercy doesn't care about the past. Mercy is all about the future. Mercy likes to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Let's not look back there. Let's talk about tomorrow. Now, if you're a truth person and you've got mercy talking to you, going, I'm sorry, let's not really deal with this, no wonder you're going to have an explosion, because one person doesn't feel seen or heard. For many of us, this is some of the conflicts that happen in our own marriages. Now, there's another character in this story, and his name is Justice. And justice isn't about the future, and it's not about the past. Justice is, how am I sure? How can I be so sure that what happened back then won't happen again? And what happened back then, how are you going to make it right? How are you going to make it right? Well, if that tone or that posture comes across a little bit too harsh, someone's either going to find themselves in another conflict, or they're going to find themselves just trying to avoid. And so justice sometimes frustrates a ton of people. Peace, on the other hand, peace in its most natural state is all about shalom in Hebrew. It's about human flourishing. It's about looking for the ways where both parties can come together and actually flourish, moving ahead. But also peace gets a bad rap because sometimes we define peace as a lack of engagement. I'll just let it go on. It'll just happen. I don't really want to work at it. And it's kind of the hands in the pot.